Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending our webinar today. I am Mallory Mullen, the Associate Director of Sales at Good Shepherd Pro, and today we're going to talk about managing pipelines, specifically when to say no to an opportunity. I have invited one of Good Shuffle's users and one of my favorite people in the world, Lindsay. Here she is joining us today. Lindsay and I connected for the first time, I think a couple years back. And one of the things that stood out to me about Lindsay is her confidence in knowing who she wants to do business with. So I thought she would be the perfect person to have a quick conversation with today, talking about when to say no to clients. We're going to touch on the red flags to look for when figuring out when you're going to say yes or no to a client, how to say no, and then what are the dangers of saying yes to the wrong client. So, Lindsay, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for your patience. I'm sorry about the technical
Oh
difficulties.
my gosh, no, I think that was our fault on our end. So, appreciate your patience and jumping in with us today.
For sure.
Amazing. Before we get to our questions today, I'd love for you to introduce yourself a little bit, who you are, how long you've been in business, and where you're located.
So Lindsay Seal, I own Vivant Event Rentals. We're based in Tampa, Florida. And over the last few years, we've spent our efforts in growing our out-of-state reach. So we actually go from the Florida Keys all the way up to northern Michigan. And this summer, we're even going into northern New York. So, all over the place. It's been a wild, wild journey.
That's amazing. And I assume that your reach has come due in large part to the fact that you're pretty picky with who you do business with.
I would say it's not a matter of being picky about who we do business with, but it's a matter of like, what is the brand aesthetic that we've curated? And when people recognize that they have a client who fits the Vivant style, then that's like we're the first that they think of. And that's really the brand that we've tried to curate, is curating a brand that people look at us and they're like, okay, this client wants this aesthetic. I know exactly who to go to for rentals. And that's really been an amazing journey to get to.
Yeah, it's been so fun to see that journey for you because I remember when we met at your warehouse a couple years ago, you have a very defined aesthetic. And
Mhm.
I think a lot of business owners are sometimes afraid of being too narrow in their approach of what it is they do and do well, but it's clearly been successful for you.
Yes, I really like self-improvement and business books and things like that. And when I was starting Vivant, I read this book called, it has the silliest name, called Taking Care of Business, like the song. And one of the big call outs of that book was keep your main thing your main thing. And as you do business and as you grow, there's always going to be people who come to you with different needs. And it's really hard to say no, that you can't meet that need because it doesn't fit your brand. And so it is hard to say no to opportunities sometimes. But I also think that if we haven't said no along the way, then we certainly would have a very hodgepodge collection of
Yeah.
items because, you know, there's even something like as silly as this is just an example, right? The black chairs with the caning,
Mhm.
and they're a beautiful chair that has a really lovely aesthetic. Um, but every planner is probably going to use them one time because they're so specific. And so I don't bring in things that are very one use specific, just because then it becomes harder and harder to get those turns on it. So sometimes you have to say no to what people are requesting because you're like, it's kind of trendy.
Yeah.
And I've even said point blank, how many times are you going to use it? And they go, once. And I go, okay, there's my answer, is that it's just
Yeah.
not going to be for me.
Yeah. That's, I think, when we were preparing for our conversation today, I think when we were talking through some of the red flags, if you will,
Mhm.
of what to look out for when doing business with clients, right? One of the first things that you mentioned to me was an aesthetic match. So
Mhm.
tell the folks watching today, like, what does that mean to you? I mean, the plaque chair is I think a really good, perfect example. What else might business owners consider kind of in that vein?
So I'll start by saying I'm not a general rental company. That was not kind of my intention when we started out. So a lot of times, you have businesses that are doing draping and lighting and tabletop and furniture and dining and all of those things. And so obviously there's nothing wrong with that. That's just not where my perspective comes from because I have a more of a niche kind of defined mentality for how we're curating our collection. And also like I just don't want to do tabletop.
Yeah.
I don't want to do draping. I don't want to do
Yeah.
stuff. I don't do florals or lighting or things like that. So um, when we talk about curating a brand and then having to say no to clients along the way. When people reach out, I don't want to say that you like prejudge, right? But you also kind of have to get more information about what the event is truly needing. So for example, if somebody comes to me and they say, "Oh, the design is modern and this and that." I'm like, "Okay, we can take a stab at this." But I understand that Vivant may not be the right fit because we really don't have modern pieces. We don't have boho pieces. So there is a way to kind of curate your response based on what you know you're going to be able to provide successfully. And I think that's too is like, I'm never afraid to say no, that I won't be able to meet the client's need.
Yeah.
Because heaven forbid you're trying to fit like a square peg in a round hole. And then all of a sudden they're like, well, this isn't what I want. And now you're going back and forth. You're wasting everybody's time kind of spinning our wheels when in my mind, I know there's a better fit out there for them. And so while it always stinks when you're like, I just don't think it's going to be a good fit, on the flip side, I think it builds rapport for the next time that person does have the right client for you.
Hmm. I mean, clear is kind, right? And I think you've done such a good job on one, because you have such a clear aesthetic. Already you're kind of attracting a clientele that makes it that harmony a little bit easier, right? But then
Yes,
because you have such a defined aesthetic and brand to your business, I'd assume that it makes it a little bit softens the blow a little bit, I guess, when you're saying no, of like, hey,
yeah,
you want this like clearly
yeah,
poppy, colorful event, and like,
yeah,
here's the portfolio of events that we usually do. There's not an alignment here.
correct. And when it comes to like red flags, right? When you get an inquiry for a styled shoot, for a marketing event, for even a wedding, across the board, I'm always trying to figure out from my end, like whether or not it is a really good match. So there are two things, right? Is it an aesthetic match? Yes or no? Because that's their style and it aligns with the Vivant style. And it projects the style of the client that I want to bring in. And is there a professional match? So those are really the two things that are going to define whether or not you feel like it's a good fit. And so if it's an aesthetic match, right, I'll go to their website. If it's somebody I've not worked with before, if it's a marketing inquiry, go to their website, go to their Instagram, like check out items that have been published. Not because you have to be published to work together, but because a lot of times those are some of their favorite events, right? Those are the ones that they're most proud of, the ones that they really submit for publication. So I want to see if we're kind of operating from the same mindset in terms of design. And then when it comes to communication, I come from a pretty high-end background in California, and there was always this formality of communication. So if people are not using a greeting or calling me by name or providing good details, like well thought out, curated email, I realize that we may not be operating at the same wavelength, and
Mhm.
that may make our future communications much more challenging. I'm a very communicative person, so if I can't get the information that I need, it's probably going to be the same way until the very end when can you send me a floor plan? Can you tell me how to deliver here? Can you're kind of always going to be pulling teeth to get that information. And then one of the third things that after I send it back in a response to the inquiry is I always pay attention to how they respond to the minimums that are shared. Our inquiry response email is very thorough. It goes through all of the details about our pricing, our delivery costs, our planning resources. And so when somebody comes back and says, oh, we will, so for example, we'll get to the minimum,
Mm,
that to me is a big red flag because, and I just feel like sometimes as rental companies, we need permission to do this, but the minimum doesn't meet, like if somebody meets your minimum, it doesn't mean you still have to work with them. The minimum is there to protect your time and your labor. It's not there so that you have to say yes to every potential client. And that probably leads us into our next, next about how do you say no? And I have templates for a lot of things that I reply to. And I also practice a lot, like if I have to have a difficult conversation. So I'll kind of go through three scenarios, right? Starting off with probably the most challenging one is having a difficult conversation live. And maybe you're firing a client. And if you haven't fired a client, you probably have a client that you should fire. And so let today be the day that you fire the client because they're draining. They're not really meeting like where you want to go. For example, we had a client that we worked with all the time. And they, every time the team would come back, they're like, this person is just so nasty. They're so rude. They're so, they're not organized and they make everything hard. And we move things around 50,000 times and they never have a floor plan. And so finally you're just like, is the juice worth the squeeze? Right? Like, is this really worth our time? And I don't like how they're treating us as partners. And so the reality is like I practiced in front of the mirror, like I need to have a really hard conversation with you. Unfortunately, I don't think that how we operate our businesses align, and I don't think it will be a match to move forward with any events moving forward. And that's really hard for people to hear sometimes. And then when they come back, which they will come back even after you've told them that they are dismissed, um, conveniently your books are always full. Your schedule is closed for that weekend because it's not worth it. And you don't have to get into the same conversation over and over and over again, but you do have to protect your bandwidth. Um, then, like when you talk about something like a styled shoot, for example, and you obviously, as a rental company, get a ton of inquiries for styled shoots. And the first thing that I always ask is, do you have a budget to assist with labor and delivery costs? Because it's one thing if I provide a piece of equipment that I have sitting in my warehouse that's bought and paid for, and it's another thing to have your labor covered.
yes.
So when you get an inquiry for a styled shoot, that's the first thing that I'm probably going to ask. If it's in busy season, the answer is automatically no. We do not take styled shoots during busy season. So if we're going to kind of revisit these things during the summer here in Florida is our off season typically, then the answer is, okay, this is something that we can consider. Do you have a budget? And if the answer is no, then you can just say, unfortunately, we won't be able to participate because we need to have our hard costs covered.
Mm, yeah.
And if you do have some wiggle room in your budget, like please don't hesitate to come back. But unfortunately, we won't be able to accommodate, for free.
You know what I really love that is coming up a lot in your language, Lindsay, is you're talking a lot about being a right match and doing business with somebody needs to be a win-win on both sides. And
Mhm.
I spent about 10 years in the events industry myself before joining Good Shuffle. And one of the things that I love most about this industry is it is full of problem solvers and full with people with these like big giant hearts that want to give and make people's dreams come true, right? But what you've done is pointed out several scenarios here where there's not an alignment. And just because you provide a good and service to the market does not mean that it is a win for you
Correct.
to do business with all of those people. And that's
Correct.
such a great way to frame up those conversations with people in a way that's not like, you're fired or like, we're not doing business with you, right? It's not a win for both of us.
Right. And the verbiage that I always use is that unfortunately, I don't think it's a match. And or I'll say, unfortunately, I don't think it's a match for Vivant at this time, or I don't think we'll be able to service you in the way that you deserve to be serviced. And so I'd like to recommend this other company
Mhm.
that I feel like will be a much better match for your needs.
Mhm.
And it's always about kind of reframing it so that you're helping them find a solution. I think a lot of times it's more frustrating to a client when they reach out and let's say it's not a budget match. So let's say our minimum to that location is $3,000 or $6,000 or whatever it is. And that immediately is going to be kind of like your tier one of moving someone along through the process of moving themselves to the next vendor along the way. And so for something like that, I'm going to respond just as I respond to everyone else. They're going to get the same information, the same professional response, the same quick communication. And after that, they're probably going to say, oh, unfortunately, like I don't like that's just not where we're going to match. I'm like, that's not a problem. I totally understand. Here are a couple of other vendors that I feel like may be a great fit for you. And I always caveat it with I can't speak to their service or their product quality because I don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but I can tell you that they probably have items that are within your design aesthetic. And also, I think they're probably going to match your budget a little bit better.
Amazing.
And people are uncomfortable talking about money, but the reality is like in events, there's a bottom line for everything. Even billionaires have maximum budgets that they want to spend. So I think if we take the discomfort out of it for ourselves and just make it business, then it makes it much easier to say to somebody, unfortunately, I just don't think I can pull this off for you the way that you'd like it to be pulled off. And we don't discount, we don't price match. And so I think this person might be a better fit.
It's a very, like the way that you're describing the conversations are very practical, right? And I think that's the important role in this conversation of the business owner is to remain a level head.
Mhm.
And yes, this may be somebody's big special day. Maybe they've been like swooning over your Instagram for a long time. And you're still providing solutions, right? Again, I talked about the events industry is full of problem solvers. So if you are somebody that is feeling like you're backed into a corner as a business owner, like having that referral network is a great way to still help folks solve their problem while redirecting that business somewhere else. Because I still see now, right? Like you have busy seasons, you have these really chaotic times in your business. And when you compromise those standards and you take it on,
Yes.
then you don't leave room for your ideal client, for your big budget client, for these other things. And that just, I think, really compromises your entire operation, not just you as an owner, but the difficulty with your team of having to scramble. Like it flows off, it throws off your whole flow.
And if you're at capacity, so we have a logistics manager and he is forever coming to me and he's like, okay, we need to close this weekend. We need to close this weekend. And you can't be afraid to close a weekend because when you start taking on and saying yes to those people, let's say you have 4 events that weekend and they're all $20,000 events, right? And then you get an inquiry for the weekend and it's barely going to meet your minimum. Well, that client's going to be the neediest client, guaranteed. They're going to be the one who needs the most changes to their contract because they're just trying to stay within that budget. And it ends up taking up so much time. Usually they want something that's very time consuming, like a ceremony chair flip to the reception. So
Mhm.
now your team has no break, right? They spend the day, they set everything up, they got to wait around, then they do the flip, then they have a small break again, and they come back. And so it always ends up being something where it's like they're trying, I have so much respect for that. A dollar is worth a lot. And, but for some people, it's worth more.
Mhm. Yep.
And there's only so much that you can do sometimes to accommodate a request, especially if you know it's going to really derail your weekend logistics
Mhm.
and the organization that needs to be done, the packing that needs to be done. And I don't think you should be afraid to say that either. And if there is a time where I will just be very frank with a planner and say, unfortunately, this is just not something that we can work into our weekend.
Mhm.
It's going to take away too much of our capacity to be managing this one event. And we have to dedicate an extra team to it. And those team members could be at another location, performing, elevating that level of service at that event instead. And sometimes people really appreciate that you're going to give them the nitty-gritty of the business behind the scenes because a lot of times they don't know.
Right. They don't know. And I think, Lindsay, on the flip side, right? Like this is one way and you have chosen your niche in this direction, right?
Mhm.
People may be watching this and their niche is like their team are workhorses and they're able to flip the inventory and able to accommodate. So I think one of the things that you and I are both thinking, but we'll say out loud, right, is like we're not describing a right way and a wrong way to do business.
Correct.
What we're encouraging the audience to do is like define how you want to do business and then set up your operation to consistently follow those standard operating procedures. So it's not like you're beating your head against the wall every time of like, wait, what are we doing for this event? Wait, how is this going to go? Like, what are we going to do? Like, just build some consistency. And then whichever direction you choose, it becomes easier.
Well, if you have it clearly defined, so let's take the opposite, right? Let's say that there's a company out there and they don't want to do large scale production events, right? Maybe they're only a dining chair company.
Mhm.
So if you're only doing dining chairs and that's your niche, right? Then you know that you can do multiple deliveries during the day. So if somebody all of a sudden comes and wants like, well, we want this here and this there, and we want this moved and this moved, you're going to have to say no to that too, because it's such a negligible return on your investment
Mhm.
when you could be over at an already over to another venue doing that drop over there. So it's like set what you know to be good for your business and then don't be afraid to push back on people who want you to change it.
Well, and like kind of taking the conversation in that vein, right? Like setting your people up for success, right? Like I think one of the things that you had mentioned is a lot of your crew have been with you for a while, right? And you, in having these standards for how you operate, right? You build consistency for your team, and your team now has a predictable environment that
Mhm.
they're showing up to, and they can succeed for you and the client. So they just want to keep like coming back and working for you. So it's just like such a powerful, positive cycle for your entire business when you can clearly operate within your bounds.
And we're operating in a really challenging business, right? There's a lot of logistics that go into it. You need a lot of manpower and there's just a lot of moving parts and you don't get a redo on somebody's wedding, right? That's the reality.
Okay.
The deadline is the deadline. You got to
Yeah.
show up. You have to
Yeah.
show up and figure it out.
Yeah.
And so that adds another layer of stress. And by saying no to clients that are not the right fit, it does allow all of those other things to just function much smoother.
Yeah. Before we get into some of the pitfalls of saying yes to the wrong client, I'm going to ask you a question that I think you'll know the answer to. But when you reflect back on your business journey, I'm certain that like the first few times you said no to a client were really scary. How did you kind of psych yourself up to say no and be like, dang, Lindsay, like we really shouldn't take this client on? Like, was there an event, a catalyst that happened that kind of put you in that mindset? Like, how did you get comfortable saying no?
Um, I had some experience in my previous jobs
Okay.
about having challenging conversations. Um, and I don't think that it ever gets easier per se. Like it's always just rough, like it's because you feel like you're letting somebody down,
Sure.
but you can't be all the things to everyone. And I think about this all the time when, especially when we were a brand new company and we were trying to grow our collection and people would reach out because they're like, "Oh, well, you're growing your collection. Like, how about this?" And I'm
Mhm.
like, unfortunately, I just don't think that is the direction that our collection is going. And while it's really cool, it's only going to be rented out for your event. And so if you're willing to cover the entire cost of it, then I'd be happy to bring it in.
Mhm.
And then people are like, but you can rent it out. And I'm like, that's my choice to
Yeah.
know whether or not I can or can't. Like, that's my knowledge. And you can't guarantee me that if I lose money on this purchase, that I will continue to make it up at some point in the future.
Yeah.
And so at the beginning, it was all about like bringing in furniture, right? Everybody's like, this is so cool. You should bring this in. And I'm like, that is really cool. It's also not going to rent. And I kid you not, I still have that conversation with myself.
Yeah.
Like to
Ooh.
this day, I'm like, oh, wouldn't this be so cool? And then I'm like, Lindsay, nobody's gonna rent that.
Yeah.
You know, it's not a Vivant match. It doesn't fit for Vivant and it's not in our aesthetic. And so sometimes I tell myself no just for the
Yeah.
reality check of like
Yeah.
you can't do this because or it's like somebody wants you to spend an exorbitant amount of money on something and they like only want the rental cost. No, 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 never. No.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
I'm bringing something in custom for you specifically, then you're going to cover the full cost plus 20% management fee.
Yeah.
Like
It's
that's
such That's such a powerful reminder, Lindsay, that like as a business owner, as somebody who has created this brand and aesthetic and you know it, it's so personal to you, right? Like it's still tempting to see like the fun item and want
oh
that thing
yeah.
and know that like sometimes you have to say no to yourself.
Okay, Barbie Pink was like, right? Barbie movie last summer, big
Yeah.
heyday. Everybody was like, Barbie themed.
Yeah.
And it was like, you would not believe how many people are like, can you bring in this pink sofa? Can you bring in this pink
Yeah.
whatever? And I'm like,
Ooh.
no, no, I cannot because who's renting pink now?
No one.
Not very many people,
Yeah.
like it's
Yeah.
gone back to being like very specific, like a very specific event. And it's not a frequent enough aesthetic for me to get my ROI
Yeah.
on it. And also, it takes up a lot of warehouse space. All of these things that don't rent because you didn't say no and you brought it in.
Yeah.
Now you're stuck with this warehouse space and it's gone and you can't have things there that are actually going to make you a lot of money.
That's the analogy, when I've talked to customers over the years, I'm like, you are a landlord of your assets, basically. And your tenants are all of your different pieces of inventory, and they better be paying their rent on time, right? They're eating up space in your warehouse. And if you're not getting them out enough every month, then they got to go, right?
Yeah.
Because you're paying for warehouse space. And some people, I think, just like people get attached to things in their house, right? Like it's sometimes hard to let go, but that has to be a very
Yeah.
powerful conversation with yourself.
Yes. And we recently this past summer we got rid of probably I would say we probably got rid of like 40 or 50% of our collection that just wasn't holding its worth and it I just brought in bring in other things that I know are going to be a much better fit for either where the design is going, the design world is going, or, just pieces that weren't a match for our collection. And, people they may be really cool pieces, but they probably weren't thinking of Avant when they thought of those pieces. They were
Mhm.
thinking of maybe somebody like something vintage, right? Like they have a very defined aesthetic. They don't waver from that
Right,
aesthetic. It's
right.
like if you want that aesthetic and your client wants that aesthetic, it's like, yes, go with them
Yeah.
because they made the investment
Yeah.
on those pieces. They've clearly defined their aesthetic. It's like go to them, like give them the ROI on those
Yes.
pieces.
Yeah.
So yeah. But yes, we did. We got rid of about 40 or 50% of our stuff because I was just like, it's just not worth it, not worth the space.
So other than the like kind of internal dialogue that you have to have uh to yourself on like the dangers of saying yes when you should say no, what does that conversation look like then a little bit more on the client side of like if you are saying yes to a client that isn't a match, what internal dialogue should business owners be having with themselves to like remind themselves like this isn't a good idea?
I think in your gut if a client is not a match. Um, you know if they're gonna be, a PITA kind of, and you're just gonna be spinning your wheels. I think when I think about somebody who I go through this process, I recognize that they're probably not going to be a match. And you can see exactly the train wreck that is coming,
Mm,
right? The communication's going to be bad. They're probably not going to be satisfied. You're never quite meeting their expectations, but they haven't clearly defined the expectations. I'm not going to be able to provide a level of service to them that's ever going to be a fit for both of us.
mm, mhm. Yeah.
And it's really hard to have that conversation sometimes, but again, I have had to have that conversation before where I think that's one of those times that it merits a phone call.
Mm,
Um, like for example, I've redone this design and this contract many times. I don't think that we're still nailing
mm,
the end result that you're looking for. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to part ways from this project. I don't think I'll be able to meet your expectation. I don't want to disappoint you. And I do recognize that there probably is somebody out there who can better service your needs. And they'll be like, oh no, things are going great. And you're like, but things aren't going great on our end.
mm,
Uh, and it doesn't feel good anymore. So I do think that we're going to politely bow out and I'm
mm.
going to go ahead and close this contract
Yeah.
and or close this quote, and we can hopefully we can try again sometime in the future on a client that might be a better fit.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good way to stay grounded and remind yourself, right? Like it's very rarely too late to say no, right? Like you can get into something and maybe you're on the fence and you're like, well, we can make this work, right? Probably your gut is saying like, I
Right.
don't know. And you get into it, right? And you kind of continue to see evidence of kind of your initial framework of is this a match? Now those things are rearing its ugly head, right? We're trying to make exceptions to
Yeah.
the budget, bring
Yes.
in additional furniture, right? Like, and so like I think it's great advice to remind business owners to continue when you've been on the fence, continue checking in on that matrix and make sure like along the way in those early conversations that there's still harmony.
Well, and also we don't typically take business that isn't something that I want to showcase.
Mm,
Right? Like there are events that kind of just pay the bills. You get people who reach out and they're like, I want this carbon copy. Just
yeah.
put it on a quote. And you put it on a quote and they sign, they pay, and they move
Yeah.
on. They're like, that's what I want. Which is fine. That's great. You do need those clients. But on the flip side of that, if something's so rogue that you feel like you're never going to be able to showcase it,
Mhm.
then for me, that's also another red flag of just, it sounds like I say no to everything, right? Like,
I think you say no to enough things to leave space to the best business opportunities for Vivant.
well, it's so also let's talk about the flip side of when somebody says no to you
Mm,
and you're like, no,
yeah.
no, this was so perfect. Like this,
Ah,
I thought this was gonna be the greatest fit. And so when that happens, I am always just like so down in the dumps. I can't believe that it didn't work out. And typically it's a budget thing. At that point, they're like, we just couldn't swing that. And if it's a client that we work with all the time and I have a great relationship, excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold, then I will actually just reach out to them and say, is there any way we can keep this event? We love working together. We love each other's aesthetic. I know it's going to be beautiful. So is there a number that they need to be with? Because here's the thing, I'd rather make a concession of a couple $1,000s on a client that I know is a really great client and we have a great relationship
yeah.
and be able to work on that event than to lose the entire $20,000 event completely. And now I feel, because you get that pit in your stomach where you're like, oh no, are we ever going to make up this event back for this weekend?
Yeah.
And the reality is, whenever a big fish goes away, there are other big fish that come along, right? It's always a process. And so I try not to be discouraged. But if it is somebody that I like working with, I'm going to do the opposite of say no. I'm going to say yes
Mm,
and say, how can we make this work? What can we do to bring this event to life together? And like, what's the number? Because sometimes the number is it like I said, it's just a couple $1,000s on
mhm.
a very large scale event still. Um, and a lot of times that builds that goodwill, and it also allows us to have harder conversations in the future as well.
Yeah, it's such a great topic that I actually am covering in my next busy season
Great.
newsletter. I like go into this like decision matrix, right? Especially in the middle of busy season. When do I say heck yes? When do I say heck no? But then there are these two middle groups, right? Like it's a capacity and profitability thing for your business, right?
Yes.
And so if the capacity and profitability are there, amazing. That's an automatic yes. If capacity and profitability aren't there, then heck no,
Right.
right? But it's like when an event has one or the other, it's a maybe, right? And I think that that's an excellent framework. And one of the things that I'll discuss in next week's newsletter is, okay, is this a long-term client? Is this someone that I have a relationship with where I can recoup, maintain, figure out a long-term event? And that is, in my mind, working out pricing in that scenario is much different than just a price match or a discount to win a first-time client.
Yes. Yes. And we also don't offer discounts. We don't do industry discounts. No 10% extra off. And sometimes that's a challenging conversation to have. Um, but it's like how do you make sure that you're working with the right people? And just as a sidebar, because I was thinking about this while you were kind of chatting, is another thing that I will do is at the beginning of our season, I will reach out to all of like my favorite people, and I'll be like, okay, what do you have tentatively on the books that
Mm,
you feel like is going to be a fit so that I can block that off in my calendar and know to be kind of expecting and to leave room for that so that I don't have to
right,
say no to you when the time
right.
comes. But I'm excited to hear that or to read that and to hear that conversation next week because
Yeah.
that's always good.
Yeah, amazing. Well, I've really enjoyed our conversation today.
Likewise.
Lindsay, thank you so much for jumping on with me. This is a topic I know that comes up with every event owner. And is there any kind of other words of wisdom that you want to give the audience before we wrap up?
I think I've talked a lot.
Well, hopefully it's really valuable. In the description here, I'm going to drop in some contact information. So if anyone has a desire to reach out to Lindsay or I, like, hey, I've got this tricky situation, what would you do? Please know that, there's an open door on both ends to talk through and help you feel empowered to say no when the time comes.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, Lindsay, have a good one. We'll talk to you
Thanks so
later.
much. You too. Bye.